I never really had a place that felt like home, not until I met the Johnsons. My parents, if you could call them that, were barely in the picture before they were gone for good. My mother overdosed when I was 10, and my father, who never really knew how to be a father, disappeared into a bottle soon after. The state shuffled me between relatives who didn't want me and foster homes that felt more like holding cells than places to live. But then came the Johnsons. They lived next door to one of my temporary homes, a warm and cheerful couple in their late 50s, the kind of people who made a house feel lived in, not just occupied. I met them when I was 14, after sneaking out to the porch to escape the yelling inside. Mrs. Johnson, with her bright, curious eyes and her hair forever pulled back in a frizzy bun, handed me a plate of cookies over the fence without saying a word. Mr. Johnson, tall and broad-shouldered, just gave me a nod. That was the beginning. Over the next few months, I found myself spending more and more time with them, helping Mr. Johnson in the garage while he fixed up an old truck, listening to Mrs. Johnson's stories about growing up in a tiny town where everyone knew everyone's business. They never pried, never asked why I was always outside instead of inside my own home. They just let me be. And then, one day, they asked if I wanted to stay. I was hesitant at first. Experience had taught me that good things never lasted. But the Johnsons didn't treat me like a burden or a charity case. They treated me like a daughter. For the first time, I had a real home. A room that was mine, a seat at the dinner table that no one would take away. I had people who celebrated my birthdays, who came to school plays even when my part was just tree number 2, who held me when the nightmares of my past crept in. But life has a cruel sense of timing. Just as I turned 18 and started looking at colleges, the Johnsons were taken from me in an instant. A drunk driver ran a red light. I wasn't even home when it happened. One minute, I was making plans for the future, and the next, I was standing in a funeral home, staring at 2 caskets. The world felt like it had caved in. Then came the lawyer, a kind man with tired eyes, who handed me an envelope. Inside was their will. They left everything to me. Their little house, the one place I had ever truly belonged, along with a modest savings account, not a fortune, but enough to keep me from drowning. Enough to give me a chance. And so, with tears still fresh on my cheeks and a weight in my chest that wouldn't go away, I made the first big decision of my life. I sold the house. It felt wrong at first, like I was erasing them. But I knew they would have wanted me to move forward, not cling to the past. I used the money to buy a small apartment in the city, a place where I could start over. I was alone again, but this time, I had something I never had before: security. And I wasn't going to waste it. Moving to the city felt like stepping into a new world, one where nobody knew my past, my losses, or the deep, hollow ache of missing the Johnsons. The apartment I bought with their inheritance wasn't anything grand, a 1-bedroom unit on the 3rd floor of a quiet building, but it was mine, and that made all the difference. For the first time, I had control over my life. I threw myself into college, determined to turn my second chance into something meaningful. Financial management wasn't exactly a childhood dream. I had never spent my childhood dreaming about anything, really. But it was practical, stable, and would keep me from ever feeling powerless again. The numbers made sense in a way people never did. If you followed the right formulas, made the right calculations, the results were predictable. People, on the other hand, were messy. So I studied, worked part-time at a small accounting office, and built a life that had no room for distractions. While my classmates spent weekends at parties and worried about who was dating whom, I spent mine buried in textbooks, running numbers, and reminding myself that distractions led to failure. But then I met Jake. It was a Friday night, and against my better judgment, I let my coworker drag me to a party hosted by her cousin. I told myself I would only stay for an hour, make polite small talk, and then go home to finish an assignment that wasn't due for another 2 weeks. But then I saw him. Jake stood near the kitchen, laughing at something his friend had said, his entire face lighting up with a warmth that made my stomach flip in a way I didn't understand. He had that effortless confidence that made people gravitate toward him, But what caught my attention wasn't just his easy charm. It was the way his eyes softened when he listened to someone speak, as if every word mattered. I told myself I was imagining it. Then he caught me staring. Instead of looking away or smirking like most guys would, he tilted his head slightly, curiosity flickering in his expression, and then, without hesitation, walked straight toward me. "Do we know each other?" His voice was smooth, but there was no arrogance in it, just genuine interest. I shook my head, gripping my cup a little tighter than necessary. "No, I don't think so." He didn't leave. "Then I guess we should change that," he said, offering his hand with a grin that made something in my chest tighten. "I'm Jake." I hesitated for only a second before taking his hand. You're the only person here who looks like she's mentally calculating the probability of regretting this conversation," he interrupted, laughing. "Did I get that right?" I blinked. "That's oddly specific. And accurate." I should have walked away, should have reminded myself that distractions weren't part of the plan, but something about Jake made it impossible to do anything but stay. We talked for hours. Somewhere between our conversation about favorite books and my sarcastic rebuttal to his terrible movie recommendations, I realized I was laughing, really laughing, for the first time in what felt like forever. And just like that, Jake became a part of my life. At first, I tried to keep my guard up, telling myself that people left, that love was just a liability waiting to happen. But Jake was patient, never pushing, never demanding more than I was willing to give. He showed up when I had long days, bringing takeout and insisting that even the most independent people needed someone to remind them to eat. He learned the names of every professor I liked and the ones I barely tolerated, listening to my endless complaints about coursework with an amused expression that never wavered. And when I finally told him about my past, the Johnsons, the loneliness, the way I had learned to exist without expecting anyone to stay, he didn't look at me with pity. He just held my hand and said, "You don't have to do everything alone anymore." By the time I graduated, I couldn't imagine a future that didn't have him in it. I landed a solid job at a financial firm downtown, and Jake, ever the adventurer, started working for a travel company that let him bounce between projects in different states. Life settled into something steady, something that felt safe in a way I had never experienced before. One quiet evening, months after graduation, we sat on the balcony of my apartment, watching the city lights flicker like distant stars. He was uncharacteristically quiet, tapping his fingers against his knee like he was trying to work up the courage to say something. Then he exhaled sharply and turned to me. "I know we don't talk about the future much," he admitted, running a hand through his hair, "but I can't picture mine without you in it." I held my breath. "I don't have some big speech prepared," he continued, "and I don't have a ring yet because I wanted you to help pick it, but—" "Yes!" The word left my lips before he even finished. He blinked. "Wait, really?" That was suspiciously fast. I laughed, leaning forward until our foreheads touched. "Did you really think I'd say no?" A slow, breathtaking smile spread across his face. "I was hoping, but you do love surprising me. We didn't need a grand wedding, didn't want the stress of elaborate planning or unnecessary expectations. So we did it our way, just the two of us, a courthouse ceremony with no witnesses except the judge and an old couple waiting for their turn. It was simple. It was perfect. It was ours. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't just surviving. I was happy. Marriage wasn't the fairy tale people made it out to be, but Jake and I had built something real, something strong enough to weather life's uncertainties. We weren't rich, but we were comfortable, balancing our different careers with late-night dinners and weekend getaways when his job didn't send him across state lines. The apartment, the one I had bought with the Johnsons' inheritance, became our home, filled with quiet laughter, half-finished puzzles, and a stubbornly leaning bookshelf that neither of us ever bothered to fix. And then came the call that changed everything. Jake's mother, Mrs. Carter, had always been warm in a distant sort of way, polite in phone conversations, but never overly involved in our lives. His father, Mr. Carter, was quieter, a man who spoke in slow, measured words and never wasted time on unnecessary pleasantries. We visited them for holidays, exchanged birthday cards, and maintained a steady, unspoken understanding that we loved each other in the way people do when they don't see each other often. But now, Mrs. Carter's voice was shaking over the phone. "Your father's health is declining faster than we expected, and I can't do this alone anymore," she admitted, the words tumbling out like they had been held in for too long. "He needs care, and the medical bills are piling up, and Jake, we need you." We had talked about this before, in vague hypothetical conversations that we never thought would become reality so soon. Jake was practical, logical, and deeply loyal, so his answer was immediate. "We'll come," he said, squeezing my hand as if to anchor himself. "We'll figure it out." But figuring it out turned out to be more complicated than we had imagined. Jake's job had stationed him in another state for the next 6 months, and quitting wasn't an option, not unless we wanted to throw away everything we had worked so hard to build. After hours of discussion, of back and forths filled with hesitant compromises, we landed on the only option that made sense. I would go. I would move in with his parents and take care of them while he worked from afar, visiting whenever his schedule allowed. It wasn't ideal, but it was necessary, and that had always been enough of a reason for me to act. Before I left, we made a decision together. My apartment, the home I had built from the remnants of my past, would be rented out while I was gone. The extra income would help with the growing list of expenses that came with caring for 2 ailing parents, and I told myself it was just temporary, just until things stabilized. I had no idea how much would unravel before that happened. The first few weeks at the Carter household were an adjustment, a blur of hospital visits, medication schedules, and long nights spent watching over Mr. Carter as his condition worsened. Mrs. Carter, once composed and meticulous, started to unravel under the weight of it all, her grief manifesting in sharp words and restless movements as she paced the house like a ghost. I did what I had always done. I adapted. I cooked meals that no one had the appetite to eat, cleaned rooms that stayed untouched, and quietly handled bills that Mrs. Carter forgot to open. I didn't complain, didn't question, didn't allow myself to dwell on the exhaustion that settled into my bones like a permanent fixture. And then Lauren arrived. Lauren, Jake's half-sister, was a force of nature wrapped in designer scarves and subtle smirks, a woman who had built her entire identity around the art of effortless manipulation. I had met her only a handful of times before, brief encounters at family gatherings where she had offered polite smiles and insincere compliments before vanishing into the background. But now, she was here to stay. She swept into the house with an air of entitlement so thick it felt suffocating, claiming the guest room as if it had always belonged to her and barely acknowledging my presence beyond a perfunctory nod. "I figured it was time I stepped in," she announced over dinner one evening, spearing a piece of asparagus with practiced elegance. "Mom needs real family around, and since Jake is too busy working, I suppose I'll have to do." The implication was clear. I wasn't real family. Mrs. Carter, still fragile and grieving, clung to Lauren like a lifeline, leaning into her reassurances and treating her arrival as some kind of divine intervention. At first, I tried to ignore it, telling myself that if Lauren truly wanted to help, then maybe this wouldn't be so bad. I was wrong. She made herself at home in the worst possible way, subtly inserting herself into every aspect of the household while undermining everything I did. If I made dinner, she would wrinkle her nose and order takeout. If I paid a bill, she would question whether it was necessary. If I suggested a medical decision for Mr. Carter, she would scoff and dismiss it as if my opinions were nothing more than background noise. And slowly, painfully, Mrs. Carter started listening to her. I watched as the woman who had once trusted me with her husband's care began second-guessing my every move, her grief making her susceptible to the quiet venom that Lauren so effortlessly dripped into her ears. The house became colder, the tension so thick it felt like walking through a minefield every time I stepped into a room. But the final blow came when I overheard them whispering in the kitchen late one night, their voices low but unmistakably clear. "You know, Mom," Lauren murmured, the words laced with feigned concern, "I don't think it's fair that she's renting out her apartment while living here for free. She should be contributing, don't you think?" Mrs. Carter hesitated. "I mean, Jake sends money, but still," Lauren pressed, her tone so casual it almost sounded innocent. "We're struggling, and she's just sitting on all that rent money. It doesn't seem right." I should have walked away, should have confronted them, should have done anything other than stand there, frozen in the hallway as the realization settled in. They wanted my money. They wanted me to not just give up my time, my energy, my patience, but to fund their lives while they treated me like an outsider in my own family. The worst part? Mrs. Carter agreed. "You might be right," she said finally, her voice quiet but firm. "She should be helping more." I clenched my fists, swallowed the lump in my throat, and made a decision right then and there. I had given up enough. And I wasn't going to let them take anything else from me. For weeks, I swallowed my anger, pretending not to notice the way Mrs. Carter's attitude toward me had shifted after her late-night conversation with Lauren. She no longer thanked me for anything, no longer trusted my judgment, no longer saw me as someone who had put her life on hold to care for her dying husband. Instead, she treated me like an inconvenience, a parasite, someone who should be grateful to live under her roof despite the fact that I had sacrificed everything for them. Lauren, emboldened by her newfound influence, didn't bother hiding her satisfaction. She moved through the house like a queen, issuing commands disguised as suggestions, chipping away at my patience with every calculated smirk and condescending remark. I started noticing small things missing, my favorite coffee mug replaced by one of Lauren's tacky novelty ones, my folded laundry mysteriously scattered, my carefully balanced grocery list altered to include absurdly expensive items that Lauren insisted we needed. But the final betrayal didn't come in the form of missing household items or whispered criticisms. It came from Mr. Carter. His health had taken a sharp decline, his body growing weaker with each passing day, his once sharp mind slipping into the fog of inevitable loss. But one evening, when the house was unnervingly silent and the air felt thick with unspoken words, he called me into his room with a weak, shaking voice. "Come here, dear," he murmured, his hand barely strong enough to beckon me closer. "There's something you need to hear." I sat on the edge of his bed, ignoring the tightness in my chest as I watched the once powerful man struggle to lift his head. He was a shadow of himself, but his eyes, those tired, knowing eyes, held the sharpness of someone who had seen far too much. "Be careful," he whispered, his fingers twitching as if they wanted to grip my hand, but no longer had the strength. "Lauren and her mother, they are planning something." I should have stopped it sooner. A chill crawled down my spine as I leaned in, forcing myself to breathe evenly despite the sudden rush of dread pooling in my stomach. "What are they planning?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. His breathing was labored, each word a painful effort, but the urgency in his eyes made my heart pound. "They want you gone," he admitted, his gaze flickering toward the door as if afraid someone might hear. "But not before they take everything you have. Your money. Your apartment. They want to force you to sell." I felt my body tense, my mind racing through every interaction, every passive-aggressive comment, every offhand remark about how unfair it was that I had extra income while they struggled. The pieces clicked into place, each one more infuriating than the last. They weren't just trying to make my life miserable, they were setting me up. I gritted my teeth, barely able to contain the anger rising in my chest. "How do you know this?" Mr. Carter exhaled weakly, his eyelids fluttering as exhaustion threatened to pull him under. "I heard them, talking. They don't think I listen anymore." His lips curled in a sad, knowing smile. "They underestimate me, just like they underestimate you." A lump formed in my throat as I reached for his hand, squeezing gently despite the overwhelming rage surging through me. "I won't let them do this," I vowed, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. I'm not going to let them take anything else from me. His fingers curled weakly around mine, his grip barely there, but his eyes, oh, his eyes, held something that almost looked like pride. "Good girl," he murmured. "It's time to go." I wanted to tell him that I couldn't leave yet, that I had come here to help, that I wasn't the kind of person to walk away when someone needed me. But the truth, the awful, inescapable truth, was that I had already done everything I could. And they would never see it that way. That night, I packed in silence, moving like a ghost through the house that had never truly felt like home. I took only what I needed, leaving behind anything that would weigh me down. My hands shook as I stuffed my suitcase with clothes, documents, and the last remnants of my patience. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't leave a note. I simply left. Jake was across the country, unaware of just how much I had endured, unaware of how deep the betrayal had run. I had shielded him from it, not wanting to burden him while he was working, but as I sat on a bus bound for his city, staring blankly at the unfamiliar streets passing by, I realized that keeping quiet had only given his mother and sister more power. That was over now. When I arrived at his apartment, exhausted and emotionally drained, I barely made it through the door before the dam broke. The moment I saw him, saw the concern in his eyes, saw the way he immediately reached for me without hesitation, I collapsed into his arms. For the first time in months, I let myself break. I told him everything. I told him about the whispered conversations, the manipulations, the way his mother had slowly turned against me, the way Lauren had twisted every situation to her advantage. I told him about Mr. Carter's warning, about how they had been planning to force me into selling my apartment, about how I had spent months giving up everything only to be treated like an outsider in my own marriage. I expected him to be shocked. I expected him to be angry. But nothing could have prepared me for the sheer fury that burned in his eyes. They did what? His voice was low, controlled, but I could feel the barely contained rage simmering beneath the surface. They tried to take your apartment? After everything you did for them? I nodded, my throat tight, my hands still shaking from the weight of everything I had carried for so long. I couldn't stay, Jake. I just couldn't. He exhaled sharply, his jaw clenching as he pulled me closer, his grip protective and unyielding. You shouldn't have had to. The next morning, he made the call. It wasn't a long conversation, just a few clipped sentences, a tone so cold it sent chills down my spine. I know everything, he told his mother, his voice devoid of the warmth he usually reserved for family. And from this moment forward, you and Lauren will never see another dime from me. There was shouting on the other end, frantic apologies, desperate attempts to twist the situation in their favor, but Jake didn't give them the chance. He hung up. And just like that, we were free. I had spent months bending over backward for people who had never truly seen me as family, had given up everything for a woman who had turned on me the moment it suited her. But in the end, it didn't matter. Because Jake had chosen me. And for the first time in a long, long time, I had chosen myself, too. The silence after Jake hung up the phone was almost suffocating, a heavy, lingering quiet filled with all the things that had gone unsaid for too long. I sat on the edge of the couch, my hands gripping the fabric so tightly that my knuckles ached, my heart pounding with the weight of everything that had just happened. It was over. Just like that, with a few sharp words and the click of a call ending, Jake had severed the last remaining ties to his mother and sister, cutting off the financial support they had relied on so blindly. I should have felt relief, should have been celebrating the fact that they could no longer manipulate us, could no longer take from me what was never theirs to claim. But instead, all I felt was exhaustion. Jake ran a hand through his hair, his jaw tight as he stared at the phone like it might ring again, like he was daring it to. His face was unreadable, his expression a mask of quiet fury, but when he finally turned to look at me, the anger softened into something else, something heavier. I should have seen it sooner, he admitted, his voice low but steady, a quiet storm barely contained beneath the surface. I should have stopped it before it ever got this far. I wanted to tell him that it wasn't his fault, that I had made my own choices, that I had walked into that house believing I was helping, believing that kindness would eventually be repaid with kindness. But I couldn't find the words, couldn't find the energy to lie to him when the truth was so much simpler. They never saw me as family, I said, my voice hollow, the realization settling in like a stone in my chest. I was just a resource to them. Jake's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his breath coming out in sharp, controlled exhales as he struggled to rein in the anger that was so clearly threatening to boil over. "They won't get away with it," he said, his voice laced with quiet determination. "They don't get to treat you like that and walk away like nothing happened." But they already had. They had used me, discarded me, and moved on, and the only thing I could do now was make sure they never had the chance to do it again. Jake didn't go to work that day. Instead, he stayed home with me, his presence a quiet reassurance as we sat together in the apartment that had once felt like a home, but now felt like a refuge. We made plans, not just to recover, but to start over, to build something new without the weight of his family dragging us down. The first step was reclaiming what was mine. I called my tenant that afternoon, explaining that I would be returning to my apartment earlier than expected, and thankfully, she had been planning to move out soon anyway. Within a month, I would have my home back, the place that had once represented my independence, my security, my ability to stand on my own. The second step was making sure Jake's mother and sister knew there was no path back to us. A week after the call, Mrs. Carter tried again. My phone rang late in the evening, her name flashing across the screen like a ghost from the past, and for a long moment, I simply stared at it, debating whether I should answer at all. But I needed closure. I needed to hear whatever last-ditch attempt she had to manipulate her way back into our lives. I pressed accept and held the phone to my ear, bracing myself for whatever performance she had prepared. "Hello?" My voice was calm, detached, already resigned to whatever excuses she would try to spin. "Honey," Mrs. Carter began, her voice dripping with forced sweetness, the kind of manufactured warmth that had once fooled me into believing she cared. "I know things got a little tense the last time we spoke, but I think we should all sit down and talk this through. We're still family." I let out a slow breath, gripping the phone a little tighter as I closed my eyes, grounding myself in the knowledge that she no longer had any power over me. "No, we're not." There was a sharp inhale on the other end, a brief flicker of surprise before she quickly smoothed over it with another attempt at diplomacy. "Darling, you know I was just under a lot of stress. Losing your father. You lost me, too," I interrupted, my voice sharper now, steadier than I had expected. "You lost me when you let Lauren manipulate you, when you decided that I wasn't good enough to be part of your family unless I was giving you something. You lost me when you tried to take my home from me." There was silence, the kind that stretched just long enough to confirm that she hadn't expected me to fight back, hadn't anticipated that I had finally learned how to say no. She started, but I didn't let her finish. "I'm not your daughter-in-law anymore," I continued, my voice firm, unwavering. "I'm Jake's wife. That's it. And if you ever try to contact me or Jake again, you won't like how I handle it." She made a strangled noise, half indignant, half panicked, but I didn't give her the satisfaction of hearing her next excuse. I hung up, and just like that, she was gone. Lauren never called. I wasn't surprised. She had gotten what she wanted, Jake's mother wrapped around her manipulative little finger, their household now solely under her influence. But without Jake's financial support, without me there to be their scapegoat, I wondered how long it would last. Jake and I moved forward. We didn't just return to our old life, we built a new one. With my apartment back in my name and Jake's job allowing him to work remotely, we made the decision to relocate, to leave behind the ghosts of his family and start fresh somewhere they couldn't reach us. We found a house, a place that felt like a future rather than a past, a space we could fill with love instead of resentment. And a year later, when I held our daughter Olivia for the first time, I knew that I had finally done what the Johnsons had always wanted for me. I had found family. Not the one I had been born into. Not the one I had married into. But the one I had chosen. And for the first time in my life, I was truly, undeniably free. Life had a way of balancing the scales, even when it took longer than expected. For months after cutting off Jake's mother and sister, I refused to think about them, refused to waste energy wondering how they were surviving without the financial safety net they had grown so dependent on. But fate had a funny way of delivering poetic justice, and when the truth finally caught up with them, it did so spectacularly. It started with an unexpected phone call. Jake and I had just put Olivia down for a nap when his phone buzzed, vibrating across the kitchen counter with an unknown number flashing on the screen. He barely spared it a glance before hitting decline, his attention still focused on cleaning up the mess Olivia had made during dinner. But then it rang again. Frustrated, he finally snatched it up, answering with a sharp, "Who is this?" I watched as his expression shifted, his shoulders tensing, his jaw clenching, his eyes narrowing with something between disbelief and grim satisfaction. "What do you mean, arrested?" His voice was quiet, controlled, but I could see the way his fingers curled around the phone, knuckles turning white. I stood frozen, my mind racing as he listened, as whatever was being said on the other end of the line slowly hardened his expression into something unreadable. When he finally hung up, exhaling sharply, I braced myself. "That was an old neighbor," he said, running a hand through his hair before leaning against the counter, arms crossed. "Lauren's in jail." I blinked, the words almost surreal, the weight of them settling in slow and heavy. "For what?" "Fraud." He let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. "Apparently, she's been running some kind of investment scam, promising people ridiculous returns and then disappearing with the money." A bitter sense of irony settled in my chest, the pieces clicking together with a kind of poetic justice I never could have predicted. Lauren, the same woman who had tried to manipulate me out of my own home, the same woman who had spent months undermining and gaslighting me, had finally been exposed for the fraud she had always been. "And Mom?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. Jake sighed, rubbing his temples before meeting my gaze. "She's struggling." Lauren drained her accounts, took out loans in her name, and left her buried in debt. She lost the house. For a long time, I just stood there, processing, feeling the weight of everything settle into something strange and unexpected. I had spent so much time angry, so much time hurt, so much time wishing for justice that now, faced with the reality of it, all I felt was nothing. I had moved on. I had built a life that didn't include them, had found happiness despite their best efforts to break me. And now, they were suffering the consequences of their own actions, trapped in a mess of their own making. The next day, my phone rang. It was Mrs. Carter. I let it go to voicemail. She called again. And again. And again. Finally, out of curiosity more than anything, I pressed play on the message, her voice coming through the speaker in a frantic, desperate rush. "Please," she begged, her tone broken in a way I had never heard before. "I don't have anywhere else to go. Lauren ruined me. I don't have a home. I don't have anything. I know I treated you badly, I know I should have seen what she was doing, but please, I need help. Just enough to get back on my feet." I stared at the phone, at the woman who had once turned her back on me the moment I was no longer useful, now pleading for scraps of my kindness. I didn't feel satisfaction. I didn't feel pity. I felt free. I pressed delete. There was no going back. Jake never called her. She never called again. That was the last time we ever heard from her. Time passed, and with it, the memories of the Carters faded into the background, no longer sharp edges that threatened to reopen old wounds. Jake and I built a home filled with laughter, late-night conversations, and the quiet kind of love that wasn't flashy but was always, always present. Olivia grew, her laughter filling every empty space that had once held echoes of my past, her tiny hands reaching for mine with the kind of trust one had spent my whole life searching for. And one day, as I sat on the porch of our new home, watching Jake chase Olivia through the backyard, I realized something. I had won. Not in a petty, vengeful way. Not in a way that required the Carters to suffer. But in a way that mattered. I had chosen love over resentment. I had chosen peace over revenge. I had chosen myself. Jake jogged up the porch steps, breathless from chasing Olivia, dropping a kiss on my forehead before collapsing into the chair beside me. She's going to run us both into the ground, he laughed, shaking his head as Olivia giggled in the distance, twirling in circles without a care in the world. I smiled, leaning into him, letting the warmth of the evening settle over us. We should let her. That's what childhood's supposed to be. He glanced at me, something soft and knowing in his gaze. You finally feel it, don't you? I turned to him, tilting my head. Feel what? That you're safe, he murmured, reaching for my hand, squeezing it just enough to remind me that I wasn't alone. That you don't have to fight anymore. I closed my eyes for a moment, exhaling slowly, letting the weight of his words sink in. He was right.